Hey everybody, welcome to Board Game Heaven. My name is Raymond, and in this video I'll be taking a look at The Shadow Planet, the board game by Galakta, which is based on an Italian sci-fi comic by Blasteroid Bros, also called The Shadow Planet. I've got this Kickstarter preview book here, which shows you some of the art that's also used in the board game. It looks really cool, and it's about a bunch of astronauts that pick up a distress call from a moon orbiting the Shadow Planet. So they go and investigate, trying to find some survivors, but there's an alien entity on this moon trying to get off the planet by impersonating the astronauts and mind controlling them. And there's also a guardian on this moon that's trying to prevent the alien from leaving along with anyone else on the planet. So the artwork looks really awesome. As you can see here, there's some really cool artwork from the comic. There's also a bit of the comic book that you can read on the Kickstarter page. The link is in the description below, or you can click the eye in the corner of this video and that will take you to the Kickstarter. This is a secret role, semi-cooperative game for 3 to 5 players, plays in about 90 minutes. It has some deck manipulation. It has a sort of like a worker placement. It's got some really cool components, beautiful art, like I said. So let's start with setting up the game. I'll explain the rules and I'll give you my final thoughts. To set up The Shadow Planet, the board game, place the board on the table and check the icons on these 4 locations on the moon Gliese 667. They have these icons on them here, and that is the starting position of all of these busts. Each of these busts represents one of the 6 characters in the game, and they all have their own icons, and those are also indicated over here on the side of the board. Each character also has its own deck, which has its own icons in the bottom of the card, and you take those cards and you shuffle them and you place them next to their own icon along with their character card. The Captain, Jenna Scott, also has a special ability card that is passed along to other players when she uses her ability. Each location on the moon also has a spot for a deck of cards. Simply take the cards indicated with the icon corresponding to the location, shuffle that deck and place them on the indicated space. All of these decks have different types of cards with different icons, and the icons here on the board will tell you how many cards of each of those types you will find in that deck. So for example, you will find a lot of black shovel icons in this deck, some less movement icons, even less attack icons, and the least green threat icons. And you won't find any blue repair icons here. Every character, except for the robot, also has a number of tokens which you keep next to the board, and also keep the crawler and the moonette cards and standees near the board. There are 3 dials that are fixed to the board that are set to their starting numbers. So the countdown dial is set to 12, and this indicates the hours of in-game time you have before you need to leave the planet with the shuttle and rendezvous with the ship to return to the fleet. And the countdown dial starts at 12. This is the threat dial, which starts at 2, and it can go down to 0, and the maximum value is 8. So you set that to 2 to start. And the repair dial starts at 8 for a 5-player game, at 6 for a 4-player game, and at 5 for a 3-player game, and can go down all the way to 0 and up to a maximum of 10. These 3 icons here represent the discard pile, the removed cards from the game pile, and the nightmare or consequences of the messages from the shadows pile, which I will explain in a bit. This pile starts out with 5 different nightmare cards that you shuffle and simply place next to the board over here. There are 5 different objective cards which will be handed out to the player, and before you do that you take out the number 1 alien objective card and just set it aside. Then you take the remaining cards, which has 3 astronauts and 1 guardian objective card, and you shuffle those. And then, depending on the number of players, you draw a number of cards equal to the number of players minus 1 and add the alien card to that deck and give that a shuffle. The remaining cards, if any, are placed back in the box without looking. Shuffle the objective cards and hand one card to each player, and they will secretly look at it, and that is their hidden objective. This means there will always be an alien player in the game, and there might be a guardian player, and in a 5-player game all 5 cards are shuffled, so there will always be an alien and a guardian, as well as the astronauts. Every player receives a player board, and on the back of each player board there are strategies for playing an astronaut, the alien, or the guardian, which you can read. The player board will tell you the 3 phases of the game and the sub-phases of the operations phase where you play cards. You place your secret objective card face down on this spot. There's a space for your character markers that you place here whenever you choose one of those characters to play. When drafting a character during the control phase, you each pick a character and you can place it face down on this spot until everybody's chosen a character, at which point you can flip it over and place it here. And after deciding who gets to get the starting player token, which is this protagonist card, you can place that card on this spot. And that's how you set up the game. Let's explain the rules. As indicated on the character board, a game round has 3 phases: the control phase, the operations phase, and the messages phase. During the control phase, the protagonist player takes all of the character cards and gives those cards a shuffle. And then, without looking, they pass one of the cards to the player to their right. From the remaining characters, they may pick one character and place it face down on their character board, just like their secret objective, which they keep for the duration of the game. And then the remaining character cards are passed to the player on their left, who also pick one character, place it face down on their character board, and pass it on, and so forth, until the last player gets the remaining cards and adds to that the card that they got from the first player, the protagonist, and then from those cards they get to choose a character as well. This means there will always be a character left because there are 6 characters. And then when everybody's chosen their card, you can all flip over your character and put it back on your character board. Then you take your corresponding character's deck. So in this case, I've got Jenna Scott. This is her deck, so I take that onto my hand, along with, in Jenna's case, her special ability card, which I can pass to another player if I use her special ability. So I can just basically keep it here as well. And then every player takes from the pool one token in their color with the matching character. Now, at the end of each round, all the character cards and their decks will be collected again, and the player with the protagonist card will start again with shuffling those character cards, passing one card to their right, and then selecting a character from the remaining cards, etc. So players draft new characters every round. And every time you draft a character and use it during that round, you get one of their character's tokens. Now, at the end of the game, you will be matched with one of these characters, and you will have that character's deck. And these decks will change during the game, which I will explain in a bit. So that means that you'll want to carefully manipulate a deck of the character that you would like to end up with. But you get matched with the character whose tokens you have the least of. So the more you pick a character, the less likely that character will be your match at the end of the game. So that also means that all of the different hidden objectives, the hidden roles that are in the game, aren't matched to one of the characters that are in the game until the very end of the game. So essentially, all the players are controlling all of the characters. And this basically happens during the operations phase. During this phase, all the players in the initiative order that's printed on the board will act. And you start by applying their player ability, which is indicated with this silhouette symbol here. And in this case, Jenna Scott cancels another player character's ability until the end of the round, and that's when you hand this card to that player. All the other players have different abilities. And if a character wasn't chosen, then again, in the order of their initiative, they will activate their automated ability. So for example, the robot character here, if it is played by a player, then you take the protagonist card, but if it's an AI, so unused, then it will pass the protagonist card to the left. The robot does not have a token because it will never be matched to a player. So then, during the operations phase, there are 5 more steps you take. The first one is to play any move actions. So that can be any cards from your hand with this move symbol, the gray symbol with the foot. Now you'll notice that the board has all of these lines and these icons with the feet and the numbers, and that simply means that moving from one location to another location or from a location to a section in that location takes a number of movement equal to the number printed on the board. So by playing a movement card, I can move my character from one location to another or to a section in that location by paying the cost. So for example, with one movement, I could move my pawn from here to here into the accommodations room, because perhaps later on I want to activate this ability here. Next, you may perform a search action, which allows you to look and reorder cards from the deck in the location that your character is in. So if during the search phase, for example, I play 2 search cards, I get to look at the top 2 cards of this deck in this location and rearrange them in any order. So if I decided I wanted to get this card next, then I place this one on top and this one underneath so that I know which card I'll draw next. The third action is mandatory. You always get 1 card from the stack of the location that you're in, but you may optionally play cards with the green tentacle icon for their abilities. Plus, you also get to add to your hand a number of additional cards from the top of your location deck equal to the value of those cards played. So during the third phase, I simply take the top card from the deck. This always happens, and I add this to my hand. And I can optionally play green cards to draw more cards. And I remember from my search action before that there's a black search card on top here with a value of 2. So I might want to play this green card as well, and it has a value of 1, so I get to draw 1 extra card, which is this one that I take into my hand. Now, any card I play can have an ability. The previous cards all had no effect, so nothing happens, but this card does have an ability called Seduce, and it says choose a character in your location and take one of their markers from the pool. Now at this moment, the red and the orange character are in my location, so I could choose either a red or an orange token and add that to my player board should I want to. That way, if I wanted to make sure that I don't end up with one of those characters at the end of the game, I could use that ability to make sure I have more of those tokens. Next, you may play repair cards, which have no consequence, so you simply play them for their effect if they have any. And the same goes for the attack cards. You can play those if you want to use their effect and they have no further consequences. So now perhaps during the 4th or the 5th phase, the repair or the attack phase, I didn't have any cards that I wanted to play, or perhaps the cards that I didn't have any effects that I could use. So I can simply skip those steps. And after playing all of the operations and all the cards are on the table, I can still try to activate the location I'm in, but I have to keep in mind that I need those icons in my hand in order to play it. So for example, if I had gone to the flight deck over here, which would have cost me 2 movement, which at the moment I didn't have, unless I had played another movement card perhaps, then I have to show the rest of the players that I have either 2 movement and 2 of these wrenches, or 3 movement and 1 shovel to activate one of these abilities. Now these are the cards I had left at the moment, so I don't have those, so it would be pointless to go there. But if I did have them, I simply show the players the cards with those combined icons, and the value does count in this situation. And then I can activate that ability. So for example, if I activated this ability, it says place the Moonette in this location. So I simply take the Moonette standee, which is the blue vehicle here, and it can be used to move around more quickly. Another example here would be to advance the repair indicator by 2. So I could move the repair indicator 2 spots down towards repairing the ship. And it's very important to time when you're going to one of these sections in a location, because you need to make sure that you can pay the cost, because if you cannot, then you can't use that ability. And after you've visited one of these sections at the end of your turn, you're placed back into the main location, and a token of your color is placed on that section, indicating that you've already visited this location and you can never return there again for the rest of the game. And then finally, the third phase is the messages phase. Now from all the cards that you have played, so not the cards that you still have on your hand, from the cards that you played, you choose one card and you discard it secretly to the discard pile. So let's say, for example, I played these 2 move cards during the move operation, and maybe I played a couple of search cards, and maybe I also played this seduce card during the taking cards from the location where I'm at phase. And this is the only card I still have in my hand. Then from these cards, I secretly pick one to discard. So then, depending on what my secret role is, I can make this character's card either stronger or weaker. So if I think that this is a very powerful card and I don't want them to have that, I could discard this one. But it also is of consequence which color you discard to the discard pile. Now you can see here on the board what these different icons mean and what the consequences are of these messages. So what happens is that all the characters, all the players select one of these cards, and the non-played characters, they simply discard the top card from the location that their character is on as well to the discard pile. So there will always be 6 discarded cards. Then the protagonist player takes those 6 cards, shuffles them in with this messages from the shadow deck in the white stack, and then reveals 6 cards from that shuffled deck, and then compares the icons that they drew. Now the numbers underneath the icons don't matter during that phase. That's only during the operations phase that these matter. So you're simply looking at the icons themselves. So first you check the number of green tentacle icons versus the red ray gun icons. And the difference between them moves the threat indicator. So if there are more tentacles than ray guns, so for example there's 3 tentacles and 1 ray gun, that's a difference of 2, then the threat indicator moves up 2 spots. If there are more ray guns than tentacles, so for example there's 2 versus 1, then the threat indicator moves down by 1. So the difference dictates which side the dial moves to and how much. Next you check the blue repair icons versus the ray guns again, and the difference determines whether the repair indicator moves up or down. So of course more blue icons repairs the ship and more red damages the ship. And thirdly, you check the movement versus the search icons, so the gray foot and the black shovel icon. And the difference moves the countdown indicator. If there are more movement icons, then the countdown indicator advances, reducing the time that you have before the spaceship leaves. And if there are more search icons, then the countdown indicator moves back, increasing the time you have. But at the end of the round, the countdown dial always advances one extra step. So depending on the role you have, you might want to have a certain icon in the discard pile to advance your goal. So if I'm an astronaut, I would like to have more time prep, so I could discard this icon to make the chances of drawing these icons bigger from this pile, so the countdown indicator doesn't advance more than I want to, buying the astronauts a little bit more time. And the alien might want to also help the astronauts repair their ship, because the alien's goal is to get off the planet with the astronauts and then overwhelm the astronauts with threat, infecting the entire ship. And the Guardian wants to keep everyone on the planet, preventing the alien from leaving. So they want to stall the repair, they want to speed up the countdown indicator, and they want to advance the threat, because as soon as the threat dial reaches its maximum at 8, then nobody can leave the planet and the Guardian wins. So, for example, of the 5 cards that I played in this round, I'll select one secretly to discard. So let's just say I wanted to get rid of this card for my own personal reasons, and I discard this secretly to the discard pile, and the other 3 players, in this case it's a 4-player game, also discard one of their played cards, and those are all discarded. Then the player with the protagonist card takes the discarded cards and these cards in the Messages from the Shadows deck, and they shuffle them together, and then they draw 6 cards and they put them on the table. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these can be the nightmares that were already in the deck, or the cards that were just discarded by the players. So if these were the cards that were drawn from the Messages deck, then we can see that we have 2 green cards and 1 red card, which means the difference is 1 green card, so the threat increases in favor of the alien and perhaps the Guardian player by 1 point. Next we check the repair versus the attack cards. Both are just 1 card, so that cancels each other out. So this dial does not move at all. And lastly, there is 1 movement and 1 search icon, so that means the countdown tracker is also not moved, except for the 1 point that it always moves down. And then after all the consequences and the dials have been resolved, you simply take all of those cards that have been resolved, and these are all removed from the game in this red discard pile over here. And after every player has discarded one of the cards from their played cards, they take those cards and the remaining cards in their hand, and they all place them together back next to the board at their own spots. The character cards are also gathered and shuffled by the person with the protagonist card, and a new round begins. A couple of important things to mention is that these decks all have different cards, like I said before, and the icons on the board here indicate which type of cards you'll find more or less in these decks. And once they run out completely, then that means the countdown indicator is increased by 1 at the end of each round. So it doesn't just go down 1, but 2, and 1 extra, of course, for each deck. So if all of them run out, that's 4 in addition to the 1 it always counts down. So getting new cards is good, but you have to be careful not to deplete an entire stack, because then time will run out. You'll also notice that the hill over here with the graveyard is relatively close to the dropship, the Melita, and also relatively close to the Eureka, which is the science vessel that has the 1 survivor and the robot. So moving between these three locations is relatively easy, as well as moving to their sub-locations over there. But the astronauts really need to get to the caves all the way over here on the far side of the moon, circling the shadow planet. And these caves, they have cards with more repair cards and more of these attack cards, the red icon here, because they really need them to repair the ship and to neutralize the threat of the alien. But the only way to get there fast and effectively is by using the transport. So we've got the crawler here and the moonette here. And these vehicles can move multiple characters at once. So for example, the crawler can move up to 4 characters in addition to the driver, so the player using the crawler. So they could potentially take all the characters that are in the same location with them onto the crawler and move somewhere else. And then it gains a +1 movement for each movement card played by the controlling character. The moonette is a lot faster, but it seats less people. It can move up to 2 additional characters in addition to the driver, and the driver character's movement is doubled. So you first add up all your movement points, and then lastly you double it. Any movement points you have left after taking a move action are simply wasted. It's also important to take a minute and read all the special actions in all the sections here in these locations before you start the game, so you know what they do and where you want to go. There is one very special location, which is the temple inside the caves, that takes another 3 movements to get there from the main location to this section. And it says if you can show from your hand 4 different icons on 4 cards, then you can look at the pile of removed cards from the game to choose 5 cards from that pile and place them on the temple pile over here. And then when you need to reveal cards from the messages from the shadows pile to decide what happens to the dials, the cards on this pile have priority. That means you can manipulate which cards you will draw, and you can manipulate what happens to the dials on the board. Now the game ends at the end of the round in which one of the following conditions is met. Either the threat dial reaches 8, the repair indicator reaches 0, or the countdown indicator reaches 0. If more than one of these things happen during the same round, then the priority for awarding the victory is as follows. First the threat dial, then the repair, and then the countdown dial. And now it's time to award the victory. Now first, you need to assign each player with an identity. And the identities are resolved in the order of the objective cards, starting with the alien player, then the captain, the lieutenant, the sergeant, and lastly the guardian. And of course it is possible that some of these are not in play. The alien is always in play, and so are several of the astronauts, but the guardian might not be in the game. And the number of objectives is of course dependent on the number of players. So starting with the player who had the alien objective, you look at the number of tokens that you've gathered, so that means the characters that you've played during the game, and you are assigned the character that you have the least number of tokens of. Now in case of a tie, you get to choose. So perhaps the alien player thought, well, the character Rachel had a better deck of cards than the Reed character, and then they get to take that character's deck, hoping that it was changed enough in their favor. Then the other players resolve the same thing in order, picking the least played character from the remaining characters and collecting their respective decks. And when every player has their matching character, it's time to check for the final winner. Now, if the threat dial reached the maximum 8, then that means the Guardian player immediately wins. Since the threat was too high, the astronauts got eaten by the alien, they can't take off anymore, and the alien stays on the planet, which means the alien did not fulfill its goal of leaving the planet, and the Guardian wins. If the repair indicator reached 0, then that means the Guardian immediately loses, since the crew has managed to repair the ship and take off, but the alien is among them. So what happens then is that the alien player reveals all of their cards, which are currently in their deck, and it compares the number of green cards versus the number of red cards in their deck, and the difference is applied to the threat meter. So for example, let's say if that deck contained 3 red ray gun cards and just 1 green threat card, then that means the difference would be 2 in favor of the astronauts. So this dial would move down 2. But on the other hand, if they had more green cards than red cards, they might move the dial up. And of course, at this point, it doesn't matter if that dial should reach the maximum of 8. And then all of the astronaut players reveal all of their cards, and they check if their combined number of red ray gun cards matches or exceeds the current number of the threat dial. So if all of them together have 6 or more red cards with the ray gun symbol, then they win. But if they don't, if they're lower than 6, then the alien wins. And now if none of that happens, if the ship hasn't been fully repaired yet and the threat isn't at its max yet, but the countdown timer reaches 0 before these two, then all players compete for victory. So first of all the astronauts need to reveal all of their characters' cards again, and then they add up the number of blue wrench cards that they have, the repair cards. And if their combined total does not reach the current repair value, then they can't repair the ship. The mothership leaves and they're stuck on the planet, so then the Guardian wins the game. But if they do have a combined number of blue cards that equals or exceeds the current repair value, then the Guardian loses. They still take off with the landing ship. And it is once again a battle between the astronauts and the alien, just like before. The alien again checks their deck and compares the green cards with the red cards, moving the dial if needed, and then the astronauts combine their red cards to see if they match or exceed that number. And those are the rules of the Shadow Planet, the board game. Let's go to my final thoughts. So my final thoughts on the Shadow Planet, the board game by Galakta. Well, let me start with the artwork. I love the artwork of this game. It is entirely based on the Blasteroid Bros comic book, and it looks amazing. All the cards have art from the comic book. The board itself looks really cool, and I really like that. And I do love the miniatures here that really look like their characters as well. It's pretty cool. The busts, they're just busts, but they're, you know, they're bigger than your regular miniature, so you get a lot of detail on their faces, and they have colored bases for easy recognition, but you can still paint them if you would want to. So all of that is really awesome. Now the components, I can't comment too much on that because this is still a prototype. The Kickstarter is currently going on. If you want to go check that out, the link it is in the description below, or you can click the I in the corner here if you want to go and check that out. But it looks good so far. I do like the fact that you have, you know, a couple of standees for the cars to clearly see where the cars are. These nice busts are fantastic, like I said. The cards are small, but I mean, they don't really need to be bigger. There's not a whole lot of text on them. They have an illustration, a couple of icons, and that's really all there is on these cards. So that's fine. The size is fine. I like that they have these dials on the board. I've only seen that once, I think. and that's pretty handy. One thing though is that in this prototype, the board folds a bit awkwardly with one of the dials on the inside, and they hopefully will make the final board with a division here so that these two sections fold on the outside and these two sections without dials fold on the inside. So when you fold the board, the dials don't get stuck in between, because that could damage your board. And also the player boards are currently in this prototype just a thin kind of paper, but hopefully the final version will be a thicker cardboard. I do like that they have these strategies on the back. That is really helpful, especially for your first couple of playthroughs. You might want to read this every once in a while to remind yourself of what it is that you want to do. And otherwise, they're very clear. You got your spots for your cards and your tokens, and everyone can see them there, so everybody knows which character you will probably end up with, and it's got the turn overview and all the actions you can take on it as well. So that's well done. The theme is awesome. I really like the story. It came with this Kickstarter promotional folder here, which has the mothership here, the shadow planet in the back, and the moon on which they land. This is the moon where the whole story takes place. I really love that. And also the board. It's kind of confusing that the shadow planet is on the board here, because it makes you think you've actually landed on the planet itself, but you're actually on the moon. But it is a cool backdrop. It really looks very ominous, the big red planet there in the background, and the big circles on the board itself are a really clear indication of the places you can visit and their subsections that you can go to. That just works. It has spots for the cards, and I do like the icons next to the cards that show you which type of cards that you will likely find the most of on that location. There's one thing though, and that is that these icons are printed on the top and the bottom of this square where you can put the cards, but they're both facing the same direction. So that way, towards the player sitting on that side of the board, while I think they could have better just flipped one of these so that when you're sitting on the other side of the board, you can also clearly see the icons in the upright position. That would have made more sense. But again, this is a prototype, so that might be something they change in the final copy. And what's more is that this game has really made me very much interested in the actual story, the comic book of the Shadow Planet. So I'm gonna see if I can find a copy of that, because it's a really intriguing story. I really like the fact you've got these astronauts. They pick up a distress call from a ship that they thought was destroyed 30 years ago. But, you know, they're human, so they have to go and rescue them. So they land on this moon and they find the ship, which is mostly intact, and it even has one survivor, and they take the survivor with them. But it turns out that the survivor it's a girl, and her this one is the girl, and her father apparently is also still alive, but he went mad due to some green mist that's on the moon that he walked into, and that just took control of him or something. Something strange happened, and it turns out he's not the alien entity. He's now technically, in the story, he's the guardian trying to make everybody stay on the planet. He's preventing the alien from leaving the surface of this moon. And then, of course, there's this thing-like alien that can just take control of people and, control their thoughts and skip between people. And that comes across really well in this game as well, because you have these 6 characters. There's a robot as well, which is pretty cool. And they all have their own decks, and every player can choose a different character by drafting cards every turn. And then that, depending on which character you chose, you get tokens, and then at the end of the game, you are the character that you chose the least. So it's a very tricky situation now. That brings me to the gameplay. I think this is a pretty good game, but it's very thinky. This is not a game that you will get when you play it just the first time. This definitely takes a couple of plays and a couple of tries with the same people preferably to get it. because there's a lot going on, and it might scare off some of the people who enjoy lighter games. And you really have to like, hidden agenda games where, you can't trust anyone. Everybody is an unknown factor. You don't know who is the alien, and there might even be a guardian in play. And when you're playing with 5 characters, you know that there is a guardian and an alien in the game, but you don't know who's who. So you have to slowly figure out which players are the astronauts, which player is the alien. Is there a guardian? Is there not a guardian? And that's pretty cool. And you have to be very clever and careful when manipulating these characters in what they're doing and manipulating their decks, because you want to make your opposing players end up with a weaker deck, and you want to end up with a good deck, with a strong deck yourself. But figuring out how to do that takes some time. And that is what I like about this game. It's a real puzzler, and you really have to pay attention. Now, the first time you'll just play and you'll just, take some cards and see where it takes you. You're basically just, going with the flow, and, in the end, you'll probably, you're playing your cards, and at some point you'll realize, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or maybe I should have played this card. And that's where the fun starts. As soon as you start to realize exactly what these cards do and what the consequences are of the cards you play, or the cards that you keep, or the cards that you discard to the messages from the Shadows deck. But you discard them, and then they get shuffled, and then you turn 6 cards around, and that influences all these dials on the board. And it's then when you start to realize, okay, perhaps I should have held on to this card, but that player has a lot of tokens from this character, so they won't end up with that character, most likely. So if they are the alien, then it's okay if I make that character's deck stronger for the astronauts. And vice versa, of course. If you see that they have one of the characters that they haven't played yet, or maybe just one to check out what's in that deck, then if you know what's in that deck as well, or you're taking your next turn to find out, and you see that this is a strong deck for the alien player, then you might think, well, that player is probably the alien player. And you can try to convince the other players that you're an astronaut, even if you're not, because that's kind of what you're trying to do. And that's just a lot of fun. It really brings the tension to this game. But again, it is not something you just learn after one playthrough. Now, one thing that I really can't comment on too much is the balance of the game, because you can play this with 3, 4, or 5 players, given its nature. It's a hidden role game, so you can't play that with 2 players. So you need at least 3, and it plays up to 5. There's the 6 characters that you can play. There's always 1 that's not used. And depending on the number of players, with 3 or 4 players, you might end up without the Guardian being played. And with 5 players, you always have the Guardian. The alien is always there, and the rest are astronauts. So due to the current COVID situation and the short notice, I just recently received this prototype, and the Kickstarter is already running. I did not have a whole lot of time to try this, and so I can't really comment on how well it scales for the different roles, because it seems to me when you're playing with 3 players and there's only 1 astronaut, an alien, and a Guardian, the Guardian might have an easier time trying to stay, get everyone to stay on the planet than when you're playing with 5 players, because then you definitely have 3 astronauts and an alien that are working against you if you're the Guardian. Because the alien also wants to repair the ship, because it wants to leave with the astronauts. And it does want to raise the threat level, which is also something the Guardian wants to do, but not to its maximum. So if the Guardian can use that to push it towards the maximum, then the Guardian wins. But the alien, has the astronauts on its side with keeping the threat lower. So it needs to find a balance, between getting it high, preferably, but not too high. And it also wants to repair the dropship, because it also wants to leave the surface of the planet together with the astronauts. So to some extent, the alien and the astronauts might be helping each other. So it's all of them versus the Guardian, where the alien is more sneaky. They need to build up threat and they need to manipulate the deck so that the astronauts are weak at the end of the game and don't have a lot of ray gun cards, the red cards, versus its own green cards. It wants to end up with the deck with a lot of green cards. So I think playing the alien kind of will probably work in most situations, whether you're playing with 2, 3, or 3, 4, or 5 players. But I haven't played this enough to really comment on how well the Guardian will play. So that is my only concern here, that playing the Guardian might be pretty rough when you're playing with 5 players, and perhaps a lot easier when you're playing with 3. But I'm sure they've play tested this. There's probably mechanisms in the game that prevent it from getting too easy. But I do really like the fact that you can select different characters by drafting every round, and doing that, you end up knowing what's in those decks, but they change every time. The next time somebody else plays that same character, they're going to change the deck. They're going to draw new cards from the locations. They're going to disc or play cards, but they're also, from those played cards, going to select one secretly to discard, and that will be out of the deck. So these decks are constantly changing, and I really like that mechanism. And I also like the fact that you can't trust anyone. That's really tense. Until later in the game, you're probably gonna figure out who's who or who are your allies. Unless you're the alien, then you're alone. But you need to convince the others you're not the alien. And that is a lot of fun, I think. And I think this game has a lot of potential of being one of those easily overlooked games that turns out to be a really, really good hidden agenda, hidden role kind of game. It might be a little bit difficult getting this to the table unless you have a group of people that you always play this with, because, like I said, it has a steep learning curve, and you need to get the same people at the table with this to play this, preferably a couple of times, because after the first time, you'll probably have a better idea of what to do. And after you play this a couple of times, you'll know how it works, and it'll get a lot more fun. And if your group is into it as well, you're probably going to want to play this a lot. But if you have a group who just wants to play all kinds of different games, and there's a lot of competition, between all the games that people have that get to the table, so it might be hard getting this to the table. So it's certainly not for everyone, but I think this game has a lot of potential. So I would definitely at least go and take a look. Now, the replayability, well, again, depends on the group. So it's highly dependent on who you play with and whether they like this type of game and whether they get it and want to play it enough times so that, the gameplay gets faster and smoother and people understand what they're doing. But otherwise, this is played in about 90 minutes according to the box. We played a bit longer because, of course, first couple of times take a lot longer. But yeah, I think that's a good estimate of what a game should take once you're familiar with the rules. So it might be a game that you play once on a night, once you're familiar with the rules. But I think, yeah, this is a game that might really be a keeper for a lot of people. And then finally, there is the language dependency. Sadly, this is a language-dependent game because there is text on all the cards, and it is currently available in English and in Polish because the publisher is Polish. So there is text on the cards, there is text on the board, all of the locations and all of the player boards. They have a lot of text. The strategies here are, of course, written in English in this case. So it is language dependent, sadly. You need to have a good grasp of the English language. So I'm kind of hoping that after this first Kickstarter, it's gonna be one of those games that turn out to be really good afterwards when people finally have their game and more reviews come out, and then maybe Galakta will be able to publish a second print in more languages like French and Italian and German and you name it. So that would be really cool to see. I definitely think you should go and check out the Kickstarter, just at least read about it and watch some other reviews to see what you think about it. It looks good. It is difficult to learn, but once you get it, I think this can be quite a hit. So that was my review of the Shadow Planet. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and possibly also consider becoming a Patreon saint to my channel by clicking the link to my Patreon page in the description below or the icon at the end of this video, and that is greatly appreciated and helps me make more videos for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Board Game Heaven.